Let's start with the man in the moment, because both of them matter more than the headline suggests. Radosław Sikorski is not a backbencher looking for camera time. He is not a commentator filling airtime with speculation. He is Poland's foreign minister and deputy prime minister. He has held senior positions in Polish government across multiple decades. He has watched Russia from a front-row seat that very few people in Western politics actually occupy. Poland shares a border with Russian-controlled Kaliningrad in the west, and with Belarus, Russia's closest military partner, in the east. When Sikorski talks about what Russia might do next, he is not reading from the same intelligence briefings that officials in Berlin or Paris or London are reading. He is reading from a position of geographic reality that makes the threat feel different, because for Poland, the threat has always been closer and more immediate than it has ever felt for the countries sitting further west. So when Sikorski sat down with CBS News and was asked directly whether he believed Russia posed a threat to NATO in the near term, his answer was precise, careful, and deliberately unsettling. He said he would not rule out Russia staging a false flag operation in the next 2 years to manufacture a pretext for hitting a NATO country. Read that sentence one more time. Not an invasion out of nowhere. Not tanks crossing a border on a Tuesday morning with no warning. A staged incident. Something engineered. Something designed in advance to look like the West provoked it. Something Moscow could construct carefully enough that when the response comes, half the alliance is still sitting around a table arguing about who actually started it, while Russian force is already moving. That is the scenario. And it is important to understand exactly what Sikorski was and was not saying when he put it on the table. He was not saying Russia will do this. He was not presenting a confirmed intelligence finding that a specific operation is already in motion. He was doing something that experienced foreign ministers do when they want to send a signal without triggering a panic. He was saying he would not rule it out, which in diplomatic language is not a casual phrase. When a foreign minister of a front-line NATO state tells a major American television network that he cannot rule out a Russian false flag operation against a NATO country within 2 years, that is not small talk. That is a deliberate, calculated communication aimed at multiple audiences at the same time. It is aimed at NATO allies who need to understand the shape of the threat before it arrives. It is aimed at Washington, which Poland depends on for security guarantees, and which Poland has spent considerable energy trying to keep focused on the European theater during a period when American political attention has been pulling in multiple directions. And it is aimed at Moscow, because one of the ways you complicate a false flag operation is by talking about it publicly before it happens. Once the concept is on the table, once the media has covered it, once alliance defense ministries have been briefed on the possibility, the operation becomes harder to execute cleanly. The argument that follows it becomes harder to control. Sikorski knows this. The warning was not just a warning to NATO. It was a warning to Russia that Poland is watching and that Poland is not going to let the pretext go unexamined. Now let's talk about what a false flag actually looks like in practice, because this is the part that gets lost when the conversation stays at the level of diplomatic statements and newspaper headlines. A false flag operation in the modern context is not a crude or simple thing. It is not just someone waving the wrong flag. It is the construction of an event, sometimes involving real casualties, sometimes involving real destruction of real property, that is designed from the beginning to be blamed on someone other than the people who actually carried it out. Russia has a documented history with this approach. The apartment bombings in Russia in 1999 that were blamed on Chechen militants and used to justify the Second Chechen War have been examined by independent researchers for decades. The incidents in the Donbass in 2014 and 2015 that were used to justify Russian military involvement were shaped by a narrative that took months for outside investigators to untangle. The staged chemical attack accusations that Russia has repeatedly used to muddy the waters in Syria follow the same basic template. Create an event, control the initial narrative, make the truth complicated enough that the response gets delayed while the argument plays out. That template is what Sikorski is telling NATO to prepare for. And the 2-year window he attached to that warning is not an accident. Take a pencil, put it on a map of northeastern Europe. Find the point where Poland's border meets Lithuania in the northeast corner of the country. Now drag that pencil roughly 65 miles east along that border until you hit the corner where Lithuania meets Belarus. Put the pencil down. You just drew the Suwalki Gap. And if you have never heard of it before tonight, that is not an accident. It does not get the coverage it deserves because it does not look dangerous on a map. It looks like a thin strip of land connecting Poland to the Baltic states. It looks like a road. It looks like farmland. It looks like the kind of geography that makes people think about agriculture rather than warfare. But inside every serious NATO planning document, inside every defense ministry that has spent real time thinking about where the next major European conflict starts, the Suwalki Gap is not farmland. It is the most dangerous 65 miles on the entire continent, and Poland lives right next to it. which is a large part of why Poland's warning about what Russia is planning in the next 2 years sounds different from Warsaw than it does from anywhere else in the alliance. Let us talk about why. To understand the Suwalki Gap, you need to understand what sits on either side of it. On the western side sits Kaliningrad, a piece of Russian territory that is not connected to Russia proper. It sits on the Baltic coast between Poland and Lithuania, a leftover from the Second World War that Russia has spent decades turning into one of the most heavily armed patches of ground in Europe. Kaliningrad is home to Russian nuclear-capable missiles. It is home to Russian air defense systems that can cover a significant portion of the Baltic region. It is home to Russian naval assets that operate in the Baltic Sea. It is not a civilian enclave. It is a military outpost dressed up with a civilian population living around it. On the eastern side of the Suwalki Gap sits Belarus. And Belarus in 2026 is not a neutral country. It is not an independent actor making its own foreign policy decisions. It is a country whose military is so deeply integrated with Russian military planning and Russian military logistics that the distinction between Belarusian territory and Russian territory for the purposes of NATO planning is largely theoretical. Russian troops trained in Belarus. Russian missiles have been stationed in Belarus. Russian commanders have used Belarusian territory as a staging ground for operations in Ukraine. So the Suwalki Gap is a 65-mile stretch of NATO territory, sitting between a Russian military outpost on one side and what is functionally Russian-controlled territory on the other side. If Russia ever moved to close that gap, to physically cut the land connection between Poland and the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, those 3 countries would be isolated from the rest of NATO by land. Supplying them, reinforcing them, defending them would suddenly require going through contested air and sea routes instead of driving trucks down a highway. That is what closing the Suwalki Gap means in military terms, and that is exactly the kind of scenario that a well-constructed false flag operation could be designed to enable. Think about how it works in practice. Russia does not announce that it is closing the Suwalki Gap. Russia does not send tanks toward the gap on a Tuesday morning with no cover story. Instead, something happens first. An incident, maybe in the Baltic states, maybe involving ethnic Russian populations that Russia has spent years cultivating as a potential justification for intervention. Maybe something that looks on first inspection like a Ukrainian provocation or a NATO provocation or a local conflict that got out of hand. Something complicated enough that the first 48 to 72 hours of the alliance response are consumed by figuring out what actually happened, rather than by moving forces to where they need to be. And in those 48 to 72 hours, while the argument is happening, Russian and Belarusian forces move toward the gap. By the time the alliance agrees on what it is looking at, the geography has changed. This is not a fantasy scenario invented by nervous analysts. This is a playbook that has been used before in different forms. In 2014, Russia moved into Crimea while the international community was still debating whether the little green men with no insignia on their uniforms were actually Russian soldiers. By the time the argument was settled, the peninsula was gone. The speed of the ambiguity was the weapon. The confusion was the cover. Sikorski's warning is telling NATO that the next version of that playbook is being written right now, and the 2-year window he attached to it is based on something specific that is worth understanding clearly. Russia's military is not the same military it was in February of 2022. 4 years of grinding war in Ukraine have consumed enormous quantities of equipment, ammunition, and experienced personnel. Russia has been rebuilding, rearming, restructuring its forces in ways that Western intelligence agencies have been tracking carefully. The 2-year window that Sikorski referenced is not an arbitrary number pulled from thin air. It reflects an assessment of roughly how long it will take for Russia to rebuild enough conventional military capacity to feel confident about applying serious pressure on NATO territory without relying entirely on nuclear threats to backstop the operation. 2 years from now, Russia's rebuilt forces look different from Russia's current forces. 2 years from now, the window for the kind of operation that Sikorski is describing opens in a way that it is not fully open today. And Poland, sitting where it sits on the map, with the Suwalki Gap on one side and the Belarusian border on the other, and Kaliningrad sitting on its northern coastline, is not theorizing about this timeline. It is living inside it, which is exactly why Poland has been doing something in response that the rest of Europe has mostly been watching from a comfortable distance. Poland is building the largest army in European NATO. Not the largest in terms of equipment on paper, the largest in terms of actual boots, actual training, actual readiness to fight a land war on European soil. Poland has committed to spending 5% of its GDP on defense. To put that number in perspective, the NATO target that most member states have spent years arguing about and failing to hit is 2%. Poland is not arguing about 2%. Poland blew past 2% years ago and kept going. The Polish military is expanding its active duty numbers, its reserve forces, its artillery capacity, its drone capability, and its fortification of the eastern border at a pace that reflects a country that has looked at the map, looked at the timeline, and decided it is not going to wait for the rest of the alliance to catch up to the threat assessment that Warsaw reached some time ago. That is what a genuine shock warning looks like when it comes from a country that is not warning out of panic. It is warning out of preparation. Poland has already decided what the next 2 years mean. The question is whether the rest of NATO decides in time. There is a question that nobody in NATO wants to answer out loud. Not because they do not know the answer, because the answer is uncomfortable enough that saying it in public creates its own set of problems. The question is simple. If Russia staged an incident tomorrow, if something happened on the border of a Baltic state or in the airspace over the Suwalki Gap or involving ethnic Russian populations in a NATO country that was designed to look ambiguous, designed to look like it could have been caused by multiple parties, designed to split the alliance argument before the alliance response could form, how long would it take NATO to agree on what happened? And the honest answer, the one that defense planners whisper in corridors rather than publish in white papers, is that it would take long enough to matter, long enough for the geography to shift, long enough for the window that Russia needed to close to already be closing. The alliance that defeated the Soviet Union, that held the line through 4 decades of Cold War, that expanded from 12 members to 32 members across 75 years of existence, has never faced a threat quite shaped like this one, and Poland knows it. That is why the warning landed the way it did. Let us walk through what is actually happening across the alliance right now because the picture is more complicated and more urgent than the headline version suggests. Start with the United States because nothing in NATO moves without Washington, and Washington in 2026 is a more complicated partner than it was 5 years ago. The American commitment to European defense has never been more questioned inside American domestic politics than it is right now. There are serious voices in the American political conversation arguing that Europe needs to defend itself, that American troops and American money should not be the default answer to European security problems, and that the NATO guarantee needs to be renegotiated rather than automatically renewed. Russia has been listening to that conversation very carefully, because the entire logic of the false flag scenario that Sikorski described depends on one thing above everything else. It depends on alliance division. A united NATO with a clear and immediate American commitment to Article 5 collective defense is a very difficult target. The calculation changes completely the moment there is any ambiguity about whether Washington would treat an attack on a small Baltic state the same way it would treat an attack on a large Western European country. That ambiguity, even as a theoretical possibility, is the crack that a false flag operation is designed to push into. This is why Sikorski's warning was aimed at multiple audiences simultaneously, as we discussed earlier, but it was aimed at Washington most urgently of all, because Poland understands that the strength of the deterrent that might stop Russia from even attempting the false flag scenario in the first place runs directly through American credibility. A Washington that is fully committed and publicly committed makes the operation too risky to attempt. A Washington that is debating its commitment creates the conditions where the operation starts to look viable from Moscow's perspective. Poland is not the only country that has noticed this dynamic. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have been making variations of the same argument for years. They have been the loudest voices inside NATO, pushing for permanent Allied troop deployments on their soil rather than rotational ones, for pre-positioned equipment rather than equipment that would need to be shipped in after a crisis started, for infrastructure improvements that would allow rapid reinforcement rather than reinforcement that takes weeks to organize. They have been pushing for all of these things because they understand that in the scenario Sikorski described, the first 72 hours are everything. If NATO forces are already in place when the incident happens, the calculus for Russia changes. If NATO forces have to be assembled, transported, and deployed after the incident happens, Russia has already won the most important part of the operation before a single shot is officially fired. Now add the Ukraine dimension because it cannot be separated from this conversation no matter how much some people would prefer to treat it as a separate file. The war in Ukraine is directly connected to the threat Sikorski is describing in a way that goes beyond geography. Ukraine has been absorbing Russian military capacity, Russian ammunition stockpiles, Russian equipment, and Russian manpower for over 4 years. Every Russian artillery shell fired at Kharkiv or Zaporizhzhia is a shell that is not sitting in a depot being saved for a future operation against a NATO country. Every Russian armored vehicle destroyed in the Donbass is a vehicle that is not positioned near the Suwalki Gap. The war in Ukraine has been, among many other terrible things, an enormous tax on Russian conventional military capacity. The 2-year window Sikorski described is in part a function of how long it takes Russia to rebuild from that tax. which means that the outcome in Ukraine is not separate from the security of Poland or the Baltic states or the rest of NATO's eastern flank. It is directly connected to it. A Ukraine that continues to resist, that continues to consume Russian military resources, that continues to make Russian conventional military operations expensive and slow, is a Ukraine that is buying time for NATO's eastern members to prepare. A Ukraine that collapses or is forced into a settlement that allows Russia to reconstitute its forces quickly and redirect them toward other objectives is a Ukraine that shortens the 2-year window. Poland understands this connection completely. It is one of the reasons Poland has been among the most consistent and most generous supporters of Ukrainian defense throughout the war. Not just out of solidarity, though that is real, but out of cold strategic calculation. Every month Ukraine holds is a month. Poland has to build its army larger, dig its fortifications deeper, and make the eastern flank of NATO harder and more expensive to threaten. Now think about the 3 scenarios that emerge from where we are standing in the summer of 2026. The first scenario is the one NATO's deterrence is designed to produce. Russia looks at the alliance, looks at Poland's military buildup, looks at the American commitment, looks at the pre-positioned forces in the Baltic states, runs the calculation, and decides the false flag operation carries more risk than reward. The window opens and closes without an incident because the cost of the operation in a fully prepared and fully united alliance is too high. This scenario requires everything to work. American commitment staying firm, European defense spending continuing to rise, Ukraine continuing to hold, the alliance staying united on the threat assessment that Sikorski put on the table. The second scenario is the one that keeps planners awake. Russia attempts the false flag, the incident happens, and for the first critical days the alliance argument plays out exactly the way Moscow planned it. Some members say it was staged, others say the evidence is unclear. Washington takes longer than it should to publicly commit. And in that window of argument and delay, Russian and Belarusian forces move toward the Suwalki Gap, not in a full invasion, but in a demonstration of force designed to see how far they can get before the alliance response firms up. This scenario does not necessarily end in a full war, but it ends with a new reality on the ground that NATO has to negotiate from a weaker position than it started from. The third scenario is the one that makes the false flag operation irrelevant because something else triggers the crisis first. A miscalculation, an accident, a local commander making a decision that was not authorized from Moscow, but that Moscow then feels it cannot back down from publicly. A drone that crosses the wrong border, a naval incident in the Baltic, something that was not planned but that the existing tensions make increasingly likely the longer the current situation continues without resolution. This scenario is the hardest to prepare for because it does not follow a script, and it is the scenario that history suggests is more common than the carefully planned operation that everyone has been briefed on. Wars rarely start exactly the way the war games predicted. They start in the gaps between the predictions. And the gap between what NATO is prepared for and what Russia might actually do is exactly the space that Sikorski's warning is trying to close before the 2-year window runs out. Poland raised its hand. Now the question is whether the rest of the alliance raises theirs. Come back to the pencil, the one you put on the map at the beginning of this story, the one you dragged across 65 miles of northeastern European geography to find a strip of land that most people have never heard of and that every serious NATO planner has nightmares about. Put that pencil down for a second and think about everything that sits around that line. A Russian military outpost on one side, a Russian-controlled country on the other, 3 small NATO states sitting above it that depend on that corridor staying open for their connection to the rest of the alliance, a Polish military that has been building and expanding and fortifying at a pace that reflects a country which has already made its decision about what the next 2 years mean, and a foreign minister sitting in a CBS News interview telling the world in careful, precise, deliberately unsettling language that he cannot rule out Russia manufacturing the reason to move against all of it within the next 2 years. That is not a map from a history book. That is the map of right now. And the countdown that Sikorski described is not something that starts when the incident happens. It started the moment he said the words out loud, because warnings only matter if the people who need to hear them actually change their behavior in response. And the behavior that needs to change across the NATO alliance in the next 2 years is significant enough that there is genuinely no time to waste arguing about whether the warning was too alarmist or not alarmist enough. Here is what the next 2 years actually require if NATO is serious about closing the window before Russia decides it is open enough to use. The American commitment needs to be stated clearly, repeatedly, and without the ambiguity that has crept into the conversation around NATO burden sharing and European defense autonomy. Not because European defense autonomy is a bad idea. It is not. Europe should be capable of defending itself, and the trajectory toward that capability is the right one in the long run. But in the specific 2-year window that Sikorski described, the deterrent that might stop Russia from attempting the false flag operation in the first place runs through the credibility of Article 5, and Article 5 credibility in 2026 runs through Washington. There is no version of this story where European defense autonomy gets built fast enough in 2 years to replace what American commitment provides right now in terms of deterrent weight. The pre-positioning of Allied forces and equipment on NATO's eastern flank needs to accelerate beyond the current pace. Rotational deployments are better than nothing. Permanent deployments are better than rotational ones. Pre-positioned heavy equipment that does not need to be shipped across the Atlantic after a crisis starts is better than equipment sitting in American depots waiting for a deployment order that takes weeks to cut through bureaucracy. The Baltic states have been asking for this for years. Poland has been making the same argument. The alliance response has been moving in the right direction, but not at the speed that the 2-year window demands. Intelligence sharing on Russian false flag preparation needs to be treated as the highest priority collection target across every Allied intelligence service simultaneously. Because the one thing that collapses the false flag scenario faster than anything else is exposure before it happens. If NATO can identify the preparation, if it can see the operation being constructed before the incident occurs, and if it can put that evidence on the table publicly, the way the Biden administration put Russian invasion planning on the table publicly in late 2021 and early 2022, the operation loses its most important asset. It loses plausible deniability. And without plausible deniability, a false flag is not a false flag anymore. It is just an attack. And an attack on NATO without the cover of ambiguity carries consequences that Russia is not ready to absorb. These 3 things, American commitment, accelerated pre-positioning, and aggressive intelligence exposure, are the answers to the countdown. They are not easy, they are not cheap, and they are not guaranteed to happen at the speed the timeline requires, but they are the specific things that change the calculation in Moscow from the operation being viable to the operation being too expensive to attempt. Now come back one final time to Radosław Sikorski sitting in that interview. Think about what it costs a foreign minister to say what he said. Not personally, professionally. When a senior government official of a NATO member state goes on American television and says he cannot rule out a Russian false flag operation against a NATO country in the next 2 years, that statement does not stay in the interview. It travels. It lands on desks in Brussels and Washington and Berlin and Paris. It gets read in Moscow. It gets analyzed in Beijing. It generates questions that the government then has to answer. It creates pressure that the official then has to manage. Sikorski said it anyway, because the alternative, staying quiet, keeping the warning inside classified briefings, allowing the public conversation about European security to continue without the specific shape of the threat being named clearly, was a worse option than the discomfort that comes from saying it out loud. That is what genuine alarm looks like when it comes from someone who knows how to measure their words. Not panic, not speculation, not a politician chasing headlines. A measured, careful, deliberately public statement from a man who has spent his career reading Moscow, who sits at the geographic center of the threat he is describing, and who decided that the 2-year window was too short and too serious to leave unnamed. Poland gave Putin a warning, not with a missile, not with a military exercise, with words spoken clearly into a camera in a way that was designed to be heard by every audience that needed to hear it at the same time. And the countdown that those words described is not waiting for anyone to feel ready, it is already running. The question that the next 2 years will answer is not whether Russia is thinking about it. Sikorski already told you Russia is thinking about it. The question is whether NATO thinks about it faster. This is Professor John. Subscribe for further war updates.